Today, I'm going to present a simple item about the maximum levels for lead in certain food categories. Everyone knows that lead is a dangerous item. Even other scientific entities, there is no threshold about the hazard and danger of this material. They don't put threshold. Currently, several materials include lead in different rates, so it was very important to have a code of practice to reduce the lead in food, in addition to reviewing the maximum levels, especially the most used items. The food database is used from the Global Environment Watching System, and also a principle or a methodology was used, the R, as low as achieved, in order to determine the maximum level of lead for all food items. The maximum levels were determined for lead for certain other foods. As a background, it was recommended to expand lead work beyond food categories as listed in the CXS 193, and to start discussions to put maximum limits for various commodities. In the CCF12, it was recommended to put criteria based on which the food categories are selected to put maximum limits, focus on children food, herbs, focusing on other items and commodities. The CCF16, it was recommended to reconvene the electric working group led by Brazil to put maximum limits for processed food, ready-to-eat food, especially for newborns and children. Also, for sugarcane and brown sugar. All of that is based on the data taken from the food database GEMS. In addition to the maximum limits for herbs, for fresh food, dried and spices, all of that by following the JACFA code for the data in 2022. Next slide. Here are the proposed limits. 9 commodities were proposed according to the experts, maximum limits for lead and the dried herbs and barks. These are the proposed limits. There were several remarks from EU countries. For example, they proposed for dried bark to be less than 2.5, and other countries mentioned to avoid adulteration, the data to be extracted from electric working groups, not through the GEMS, in order to avoid that several data extracted from these countries and from these entities may have any commercial purposes. Next slide. Here, the background. If we talk, for example, the discontinuing work on the maximum limits. One of the recommendations for who? For the dried slower spices and for the fresh culinary herbs. After that, there was a reforming of the working group, and specific to study the lead in dried bark and culinary herbs. It was requested from JECFA to have a code or call for the data for spices and dried bark, as we mentioned, to exclude the data related to economic adulteration and to determine these data. Then it was requested to have a circular letter to collect the remarks on the maximum limits for the multi-ingredient products. That all submitted as a proposal for CAC 47. Also, it was adopted the maximum limits for 8 spices. And also the maximum limits for dried bark and culinary herbs. Fifth step, the 18th meeting. Here, I'm not commenting on this slide. It is for the maximum limits that are proposed for the group of products, food products, for the dried spices and herbs. We will discuss it later. These numbers are not important. Next slide. Here, the outcome of the electronic working group to be discussed in the next meeting. The working group will discuss their recommendations about the maximum limits for culinary herbs and fresh dried and dried barks. The review will be processed whether to stop with working with the maximum limits, and that will be considered advising and advancing new maximum limit proposal by the EWG. Here we can note, for example, for spices, EU working groups, instead of 2.5 grams per kilogram, they proposed 3. For culinary, instead of 2.5, 2. What is a justification? One time they increase, another time they reduce. This is for ensuring safety and to lower the exposure of intake, and to have the ejection limit high to achieve balance between food safety, public health, and international trade. Determine maximum limit for dried barks and culinary herbs. The analysis for
نلاحظ انه يعني مجموعه الدول one organization participated.
The one organization and several groups started to participate in that work. The EWG put the recommendations for maximum limits, taking into consideration the first factor, the approach, the achievable approach. Secondly, the rate not exceeding 5%. For trade purposes, the main purpose is to reduce exposure as much as possible. The data are available for spices and culinary herbs. The data available now, like 10 years ago, is not the same. Consequently, excluding the data before 2014, and the request for new data for such regard, and so on. Here, for example, One draft was separated for European group member. Here we can see the draft presented where a circular red letter is available. And several reviews from Japan, Mexico. Next slide. Here the methodology that is followed, the scientific basis by the EWG. Most important to exclude the adulterated samples as much as possible to gather accurate information to represent the actual production, not for other trade purposes. Here we can see the total data set, regardless of the samples. When we talk about maximum limits, 2.5 per gram. In the next slide, it is connected to the rejection rate. If it increases, the maximum limit, if it increases, the rejection rate will reduce. And also, the intake will reduce. If we expose to maximum limits, more exposure and more intake, the maximum limit increases and the rejection will increase. Next slide. This is an example for dried bark. As we are talking about the methodology from the EWG, the maximum limit for dried bark, it is proposed to be increased from 2.5 to 3 milligram per kilogram. The standards for balancing safety and sample rejection. When increased from 2.5 to 3, what happened? The rejection rate reduced. Because the rejection rate reduced and the intake reduction also reduced. Used to be 16, now 12. These are the factors and criteria. In the total data set, at the regional level, from 6.9 to 4.9. When the maximum limit reduced, it is normally, when we increase the maximum limit, the rejection rate reduce. And also the protection and the intake reduction reduce. Next. And the revised maximum limits. The next slide we will have, we took the dried bark. Next slide will be about spices. The committee will reduce from 2.5 to 2. Next. Here the culinary herbs. Similar to the bark, we see the recommendation to achieve balancing safety and sample rejection, away from the sample rejection to reduce intake reduction, to participate in the protection of human. From 2.5, it becomes 2. Here, the maximum limit reduced. Rejection rate will raise because the rate is limited and the intake reduction will increase. We participated in the protection of people from this item, but we need to achieve balance as low as reasonably achieved. Not always to have strict standards, not put in the maximum limit is good. Next. When we speak about the categories and scientific base and data criteria, as you mentioned, we need to rely on the comprehensive food database and to exclude for any other data that are not accurate. The public health protection to try to aim to reduce vet exposure, to reduce the exposure of human to this element through the dried bark consumption and culinary herbs. As we mentioned, the limit and rejection rate shall not exceed 5%, preferable not to exceed 5%. For trade practical consideration, the limit to avoid when the rejection rate is low, we will not impact the trade. To upload data, to ensure limit, detect current and contamination as market. Alignment with progress, work and flexibility. For example, when we have in the C18, it will be based on the previous achievements. We need to have consolidation of efforts. The potential challenge and consideration, geographic data, the coverage shall be uneven. Some data are unclear or unbalanced. Continuous monitoring, more data are needed for emerging risks. Smaller products may need support. Smaller producers, based on the experience, it comes from small producers. They don't have the ability, for example, and a smaller producer may need support along with the maximum limits considerations. Next. It is the recommended proposals from the Arab meeting, for example. What are the recommendations? Support establishment of maximum limits. To try to support or to find maximum limit for lead in these products. When there is maximum limit, there is control. So we can reduce public hazard, including African dates and Arab dates. The second recommendation to support the method applied to reach proposed maximum limits based on, as we mentioned, the maximum limit shall be balanced and it shall be achievable. So, as low as reasonably achieved. Third, support and promote consensus. To try to have a consensus in the CCF18 to reach maximum limits that are reasonably achieved, in order not to give an opportunity for discontinuation.